Okay, this is part 2 of Shiloh, Storytime with Sabrina, and we're going to keep reading where we left off. Alright. But before he could do anything towards his intended objective, a brilliant yellow light began to stream from the prince's body, and suddenly he stood to his feet. Without another word, the prince stretched out his hand towards the dragon. To everyone's surprise, including the dragon himself, the dragon began rising off the ground as the prince lifted his hand. When he was above the trees, the prince made a flinging motion with his hand, and the huge reptile was thrown away from the crowd by some unseen force. As he got farther away, suddenly the old dragon exploded with a loud noise, and small red pieces of what had been the dragon rained into the forest far away from the place they all watched from. Later they found out that the small red pieces became small red lizards after they hit the ground, who would show up as nuisances to the fairies later. But never again was the whole forest destroyed by the fire, as it had been during the oppressive dragon's rule. After he had gotten rid of the dragon, the prince wandered through the forest, touching the berry bushes and the flower stems. Everywhere he touched, the crowd of fairies watched as berries grew and flowers blossomed and bloomed before their very eyes. Following him around until he had finished his work, the fairies gathered around him, thanking him for what he had done. Then the prince touched every one of them, and their gifts from the king came back to them. Smiling and waving, the prince called to them, "Don't forget, I'm always listening. If you need help, just call me." And he stepped backwards into the other dimension and out of their sight. Chapter 4. Stirring herself from her reverie, Shiloh decided she was ready to start on the work that the prince had requested of her. Fluttering back down to the forest floor, she found a flat, empty spot that seemed a good place to start. Her first ice picture took a couple of days to finish and showed the elven prince pushing the dragon up into the air while the crowd of fairies would come. Her next ice picture was a three-dimensional one and took a week to finish. It showed the dragon bursting into pieces above the forest, while the elven prince stood with outstretched hand and the crowd looked on. Quite tired from all her creative endeavors, Shiloh slept well the night she finished the ice picture of the dragon exploding. But the next morning an unpleasant surprise awaited her when she came, yawning and stretching, out of her flower. Walking by one of her ice sculptures on her way to get breakfast, she saw several small red lizards sitting all over it, eating it away. Already it didn't look anything like what she had started out to make. She felt glued to the spot where she stood with despair. "Shoo, go on," she shouted at the lizards, finally moving towards them. But they just glanced up at her and went on eating. Shiloh didn't feel hungry anymore, and she despondently wandered over to check on her other ice picture. Same thing, covered in small red lizards, eating it away. Crushed, Shiloh ran back to her haven of flower petals and jumped in, pulling it closed around her. There she cried out her frustration and despair. How could she ever hope to accomplish the prince's desired objective when the lizards could eat her work faster than she could make it? What was the use? No one would ever even see it, let alone be encouraged by it. After a while, she heard Chameleon's voice calling to her. Opening her flower, she saw his face, looking up to her with concern. She dropped down to talk to him. "Oh, Chameleon, it's no use. All my work is for nothing. Did you see those lizards destroying my pictures?" she asked as she slumped to the ground by his side. "Yes, I saw. But what are you going to do about it?" he responded. "I don't know," she said, burying her tear-stained face in his scaly folds. "There's nothing I can do about it. The lizards don't even respond at all when I tell them to go away, and even if they did go away, they would come back as soon as I left anyway." Do you remember the point you were trying to get across with your ice pictures?" Chameleon hinted. Shiloh had to think about it for a few seconds, so great was her despair and frustration. To get people to ask the prince for help when they had troubles." She had to laugh at herself a little for forgetting the whole point of all her work. "Thanks, Chameleon," she said, smiling and wiping her tears away. "Elven Prince," Shiloh called into the air around her. "Elven Prince, I need your help." Right in front of her, the Elven Prince stepped out of the other dimension into her sight. Smiling with obvious pleasure, he asked, "What can I do for you, Shiloh?" "Oh, Prince, just look what the lizards have done to my work," Shiloh cried. "What shall we do?" Looking over at the half-eaten ice sculpture, which was still covered with the small red lizards, the prince smiled, and putting his fingers into his mouth, he pulled out something that looked like a capsule that would hold herbs or medicine. Holding it out to her, he said, "Use this." Shiloh took the capsule between her fingers and looked at it curiously. What do I do with it? She asked. Go over there and set it on top of what remains of your ice sculpture, the prince instructed. Obediently, Shiloh took the tiny capsule and placed it on the pinnacle of the half-eaten ice picture. Now step back, the prince said. Come over here by me. Shiloh came back to stand by the prince, and they watched for a brief moment. Poof! There was a small explosion, which blew all the lizards away. Shiloh couldn't even tell where they had gone or what had become of them. Even more amazing was that her ice sculpture was suddenly back to the way it had been before the lizards had started in on it. But even better than before, there was a glow or a light radiating softly from inside the sculpture that had not been there before. Oh, Shiloh breathed appreciatively. It's beautiful. You do create beautiful works of art, the prince told her with a wink. Is there anything else you need before I go? Oh, I guess I need one for the other sculpture too, Shiloh said, having nearly forgotten that the same problem still plagued her other work of art. Smiling again, the prince again pulled a small capsule out of his mouth, and they repeated the process with the other sculpture. Again the lizards disappeared with a poof, and again the sculpture was more beautiful than before, and had a soft and eye-appealing glow about it. Thank you so much, Shiloh said to the prince with a hug. My pleasure, the prince answered, returning her hug. Thanks for thinking of me. He paused and added, now you have something new to make an ice sculpture of that will help the others know that they can call on me when they need help. You mean the story of what you just did for me will help others too? Shiloh asked for clarification. The prince nodded. The others need to know that nothing is too small or too big. I just want them to call on me for help, so that everyone will see my love and care for my forest dwellers. With a smile and a goodbye nod, the prince took a step backward and disappeared again into the other dimension. Did you see that? Shiloh said to Chameleon, who had stayed in the background throughout Shiloh's dialogue with the prince. In reply, Chameleon smiled and nodded. Very nice, he said. Then he lumbered off about his own business. Chapter 5. Over the next few months, Shiloh worked hard to produce more beautiful works of ice art that would show others how much the prince cared for them and longed to be an integral part of their lives. One sunny day, Shiloh and Chameleon were out for a walk to gather some food for the day and generally enjoy the sunshine and the beauty of the forest. Rounding the bend of the red dirt path, they came upon an old friend of Shiloh's who was sitting in the clearing with her smooth-skinned, light green companion, Gecko. Looking up from their little picnic, Shiloh's friend Naomi, who had long flowing red hair and sparkly blue eyes, spotted Shiloh and Chameleon. Naomi usually wore a blue dress with yellow leggings and little blue slippers. Often she wore a tiny blue flower in her vibrant hair. With a smile and a wave, Naomi beckoned Shiloh to come over and visit. As Shiloh and Chameleon approached Naomi and Gecko, they all exchanged happy and friendly greetings. Help yourself, Naomi said, indicating the spread of food that included a forest cheese and some nuts and berries that she and her companion were enjoying together. Thank you, Shiloh said, as she and Chameleon sat to join in the meal and to visit. How have you been, my dear friend? Shiloh queried. Actually, not so well, Naomi confessed. Oh, what's wrong? Shiloh asked, looking more closely at her friend. She noticed then that Naomi's periwinkle wings had turned quite gray and had wilted since she had last seen her. Having noticed Shiloh's concerned gaze, Naomi said, yes, I accidentally bumped full on into a big patch of the black mold. It was just getting dark and a hungry old owl was chasing me. I was so scared and I didn't watch where I was going very well. Before I knew what had happened, I flew into a protruding branch and it flung me back, narrowly missing the pursuing owl, but I landed squarely in a bunch of ferns that were covered with the black mold. I dared not move, hoping that the owl would be thrown off my trail, which he was. He looked and looked, but he could not figure out which way my trajectory had sprung me. Finally, he gave up and left, and I crawled out of the moldy ferns, covered in black. Right away, I could feel my wings wilting, and I ran to the nearest waterhole to wash off, but here I am, unable to fly anymore, and my legs have gotten weaker so that I can't walk for very long at a time. Oh no, Shiloh cried, full of horrified sympathy. Maybe we should ask the prince for help. Oh, I don't know. I'm sure he's busy. I think Squirrel has a potion that will stop the weakness from getting worse, Naomi responded. Shiloh looked concerned, but said nothing. After their meal and their visit, they all said their goodbyes to each other, and Shiloh and Chameleon walked along the path towards home. Why didn't you tell Naomi about the prince and your ice art? Chameleon asked Shiloh with a puzzled tone to his voice. I don't know, Shiloh answered, hanging her head. I guess I'm afraid, after all the time I have spent and after all my hard work, that it will not be good enough, that people will think it is poorly done, and the prince will be ashamed by my work. I am afraid that maybe it is so poorly done that people will not get the message at all. This seems to be a more serious problem than the lizards eating your work was, Chameleon noted. Your work is beautiful, and yet you feel so strongly that it is poorly done that you withhold the chance to see it from those who clearly need its message. Perhaps you need another visit from the prince. Perhaps, Shiloh responded thoughtfully. Shiloh thought about what Chameleon had said that night as she fell asleep, and how she had failed to help her friends see that the prince really cared about her problem, and would much rather that she call to him for help than go to Squirrel or someone else. She felt sad and ashamed. She thought that perhaps Chameleon was right. Perhaps this was a serious problem that she needed to talk to the prince about. The next morning after breakfast, Shiloh called to the prince. As before, the prince stepped out of his dimension to stand right in front of her. How can I help you today? He asked her. Oh, Prince, it's such a long story, and I really don't think I fully understand what the problem is myself, Shiloh began. I have time, the prince said. Let's sit in the grass and talk. So they sat in the soft green grass, and Shiloh told the prince all about her friend and her feelings of shame that held her back from offering her friend more help. When she had finished her story, the prince looked at her and said, I see that your time with Lizard has left a harmful deposit with you. Would you like me to remove it? Of course, Shiloh replied, relieved that he understood what she did not, and that he had an answer. Standing up, the prince helped her to her feet. With one hand, he held her necklace up, and with the other, he reached into her heart and pulled out a big, fat, slimy black worm, about the size of her chest. Ew, Shiloh cried, recoiling in disgust. Staring at the worm, the prince moved away from Shiloh, holding the worm out away from himself. Suddenly, glaring beams of light shot out of his eyes into the slimy black worm, and Shiloh watched the worm shrivel up into dry gray ashes in the prince's hand. With his heel, the prince dug a hole in the dirt where he stood and dropped the ashes in the hole. Kneeling down, the prince pulled a mound of dirt over to bury the ashes and pressed the dirt down on them. There now, that shouldn't give you any more trouble, he said, rubbing his hands together to get the dirt off. Tomorrow morning, come to this spot and look at what has become of your shame. To be continued. Look for part 3 on my YouTube channel.